comfortable to be third world when your name has been extracted from your tongue and its gravitas unearthed from your mind. With fragments in our hands, attempted recreating beauties lost to the sleeping moon, Africa. You are the essence of innovation and origin of civilization. How have you forgotten the root of all life? The first human words were spoken by you. You cradled mathematics, rocked navigation, pressed paper from papyrus reed, burped pyramids. Were visionaries before we were accredited, so we exhaled the future. Exponential innovation and thinking for you was not a program incubated in a hub. It was your communal daily bread, imagination, the language with which we spoke to each other. Fear irrelevance brewed by old knowledge. Fall in love with the future you have not kissed. Set your own table before the world. Deck it with your own systems. Feast on your force to drape descendants with a power. Not all that is foreign is greater than your own. Hone your force. Own your ish.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this festival and this session. We have 42 participants. That's great to see. Thank you very much for joining us. The key message that, or the key purpose of this session is to explore the issue of urban innovation in a particular kind of urban setting. We're going to focus on townships and informal settlements. And we want to look at some ideas, put forward some ideas for how we can do things differently. I think this is a critical time, of course, for the country, indeed for the wider continent and the wider world, recovering from the coronavirus pandemic. It's a critical time for us. And it does call upon everyone, I think, to think differently about the situation we face, the challenges we face, and potential solutions to some of the problems that we have. It's a time that requires bold thinking. It's a time that requires new ideas and new determination to rise to the challenges that we face. So my job is to really chair the session today. I have a new appointment at the University of the Free State, joint appointment with the HSRC. I have a NRF research chair in city region economies. And I'm going to introduce, after giving a short input myself, I'm going to introduce our three speakers. In fact, let me do that straight away. The first speaker will be Kate Phillip. Kate will be very well known to many of you. A long-term advisor to government in various capacities, currently advising the presidency on the public employment program, among other things. Rob McGaffin is our second speaker. He's a lecturer at UCT and an active participant in the real estate research unit at UCT. He works in construction economics. And our third speaker, who will be a little bit later in joining us, is Jak Koseff, who works in the Gauteng province in the Premier's unit, a special unit intended to accelerate delivery there within Gauteng province. He's going to talk to us about some of their ideas about township economic development. So I think the core theme emerging is that, you know, we have a special challenge. We face a special challenge in townships, urban townships, and we need to rise to that challenge and come forward with new ideas and new thinking. So let me kickstart with some drawing on some quite timely research that was published last week from the NIDS CRAM Wave 2 survey. We were in, a colleague and I, Justin Visaki, were involved in analyzing this data and for the first time looking at the spatial differentiation, how the COVID-19 crisis has impacted on different places within South Africa. So let me just for 10 minutes or so give you a flavor for some of the findings of this research. So we break South Africa down into two typologies. Within urban areas, we have 4 settlement types: suburbs, townships, peri-urban areas, these are small holdings, and tribal areas, and then shack dwellers, which is an amalgam of informal settlements and backyarders living in townships. And then we have a division of South Africa, a more conventional breakdown: metros, the 8 big metros, smaller cities and towns, and rural areas. So the key point, I think, as context is that actually cities have done slightly better. Everywhere has suffered under COVID-19, but actually the metros have done slightly better than the rest of the country. This shows the rate of unemployment using 2017 as a baseline. The last wave of the NIDS survey showed a gap between cities and rural areas of roughly 10 percentage points. On the left, you can see. And then the first wave of the NIDS-CRAM survey, this is the results in the middle here, showing everywhere suffered this massive doubling, in effect, doubling of unemployment. And then since then, between, this is April and this is June, since then we've seen the rural area suffering a further increase in unemployment compared with some signs of a recovery, mostly through people who had been furloughed, people actually put onto unpaid leave, coming back to work, back onto the payroll within companies. That's the main reason that there's been this slight recovery. So cities doing slightly better, which is good news. But then when we look within cities, we see this massive gap between our different settlements. So this is the sort of headline finding on hunger as a sort of ultimate effect of declining employment and declining incomes. We see a very big gap between the proportion of people who said they were hungry in the last week. This was in July, August. Somebody please mute your mic. So the proportion of respondents in shacks, nearly 1 in 4, compared with 1 in 13, 1 in 14 in the suburbs. Much higher, much bigger problem of hunger in townships, shack areas, and peri-urban areas. That's the bad news. The good news is a slight improvement on the position 2 months before. This was the wave, the green is the wave 1 of the survey, and you can see everywhere was much worse off then. And it looks like the team think that this is partly to do with government grants kicking in alongside other support, maybe food parcels and so on, leading to an improvement and a bigger improvement in percentage point terms, you can see, in the poorer urban communities in terms of the incidence of hunger. Why did people go hungry? Because they ran out of money to buy food. So these figures are pretty shocking. The dates are slightly different because of the way the question was asked, so you don't need to worry about the detail. But basically, in April, 60% of households in the shack areas ran out of money to buy food. It was down to 50% when it came to June, but still very, very high. So everywhere has been suffering, feeling the pinch as a result of the economic crisis. And this, of course, arises because unemployment has been rising. So this is the equivalent graph I showed of the urban-rural split. Here, the breakdown is the suburbs in a light green here at the bottom, showing the biggest signs of recovery, apparent recovery, people getting back onto the payroll, working from home, compared with peri-urban areas, shack areas in yellow, and townships in blue. So the townships are worrying in terms of the lack of sign of recovery, and the same with peri-urban areas. Shack areas, interestingly, experienced this bounce back. We think this was something to do with informal enterprises really suffering from the initial lockdown hence this massive increase here. But then people getting back to informal trading as a sort of relatively easy activity to restart once people were allowed to start selling things on the street, and maybe domestic workers and other kinds of occupations recovering perhaps in this period. But one shouldn't push this data too far because the sample sizes are quite small. So then it comes to, when we look at the impact of social grants, the message is that this has helped to offset some of the economic devastation of job losses. So the poorest areas in our cities, peri-urban shack dwellers and townships, they benefit more from government grants. This is the dark blue shading here. They benefit more than the suburbs, although the shack dwellers, as a key point emerges, don't seem to benefit as much as one would expect. These are the poorest parts of our cities, and yet they aren't getting the grants, the level of grants that you would expect, considering the poverty levels. So the key point here is that grants are skewed towards poorer communities, which is exactly what's intended. And the final slide on data is that this special COVID grant, the the grant aimed at people who don't get other grants, particularly people who are unemployed and particularly young men, these have benefited poorer urban communities more than the suburbs, particularly peri-urban areas. Nearly 1 in 3 respondents in these areas saying they're getting that special grant. $350, it's not a lot of money, $350 a month. Nevertheless, it's of some assistance to people. And townships, more than 1 in 4 people in the townships benefiting from the special grant. But then again, for some reason, shack dwellers, relatively few benefiting from that grant. So what are the messages of this research? As I say, very high level messages. This key point that the crisis has hit the poorest urban communities hardest. That's shown up in unemployment, in lower incomes, and in more hunger. Social grants have partially offset the effects of job losses, but shack dwellers seem to have lost out from their fair share of these. Clearly, there are big questions about what happens when this relief is withdrawn. It's supposed to be stopped after 6 months. In other words, this month the grant is supposed to expire. There's now a big debate going on about whether it's extended or not. If it's not, clearly this will be a problem for these communities that are have disproportionately benefited from the grant. So, but the key message is that this is only temporary relief. This is only relief. It's not a solution to high unemployment. We need a much more concerted effort to improve townships and shack areas. And I had published a piece in Business Day today. If anybody reads that, you can also get it online. And I made some simple points that I think need to be borne in mind when we think about townships and informal settlements. The idea I'm putting across is of economic density. We need not to think of population density overcrowding as a problem. We've got to convert population density into economic density. And in essence, that means crowding investment into our townships and informal settlements, investment in buildings and infrastructure to create employment, to create skills, and to strengthen these places. That means targeting and not a uniform national response to the crisis, targeting key places that are vulnerable, that have high risks of reinfection, that are high in terms of poverty. It requires much more of a bottom-up approach than a top-down government diktat. It requires partnerships with communities, working with people and not controlling people, supporting local enterprise, encouraging initiative, and enabling state, working with people, not just issuing tenders to external contractors supplying water tanks or portable toilets or temporary shelter. It requires supporting local activity rather than just delivering to communities. And that, of course, requires government to get its act together and to be more joined up in the way it responds, not separate silos, not separate spheres contradicting each other. It requires much more careful coordination for government to work together in these places. Now, without further ado, let me stop sharing and hand over to our first key speaker, Kate Phillip. Please, Kate, will you start your
is it sharing?
Yes, it is. Are you able to expand it to full screen?
Yes, I'll try. In fact, that often goes pear-shaped.
Maybe slideshow?
Gosh, you'd think I'd have mastered this all by now. There, is that working? And does it move?
Perfect. Yes.
Okay,
yes.
great. Sorry for the slight delay there, everybody, and good to be with everybody here virtually. The big issue right now in many township contexts and informal settlements is, of course, the curveball of COVID, which has exacerbated a crisis of unemployment and poverty that was already extreme. And so the critical questions are, how do we do things differently to get different results and to build back better? This is going to require a combination of market-based interventions and support to support enterprise development and integration into the wider economy on less unfavorable terms, but it's also going to require significant public investment. In a way, the market-based interventions provide the sustainable jobs and need to take a certain amount of priority. But for as long as we have the deep structural problems that we have, we are likely to need forms of public investment in the creation of jobs to complement those initiatives. And certainly at the moment, in response to the crisis, this is a critical area. So I'm going to focus on that dimension, and I'm referring to this as social employment because it's trying to advocate for reimagining the role of public employment on terms that are more bottom up and that involve whole of society partnerships to create work for the common good. So let me explain a bit more what I mean by that and what the opportunities are. So we know the devastating impacts of unemployment on the individuals affected, on their households, and on communities in terms of not just poverty effects, but the sense of exclusion, alienation, and a range of different social impacts that act in a vicious cycle with the economic impacts to hamper development in many township communities. The big irony in our society is that despite our levels of unemployment, there's actually no shortage of work to be done. And this is an outcome of crowdsourced ideas for placemaking in townships and cities and neighborhoods. And what you can see here is, as Dr. Seuss put it, the things you can think up if only you try. And really the challenge here is to all of us to try and think in different ways about how we can create work that serves the common good, to use public investment to address some of the social challenges that we face as part of an enabling environment for the economic activity. And a critical issue really is also how to build the interface between these two dimensions. Here are the range of ideas. It doesn't take much for communities to come up with far more ideas than are on the screen for the types of work that could be undertaken to improve the quality of life in communities with both social and economic spin-offs. So whether it's community libraries or social kitchens or recording social history, counseling for victims of violence, community radio, river rehabilitation, greening of urban spaces, there really is no shortage of work to be done. And so the critical question is, through what instruments can we unlock this agency from the bottom up? And how can we use public employment as an instrument to do so? And now my screen is not moving. Let's see, there we go. I just want to give some examples. You know, we actually do have a really rich history of public employment. Within existing experience, there has been quite a wide range of innovation. I'm just going to flag some of the issues here. So the community work program, it hasn't always operated in the community-driven way it was designed to do, but in reality, it exists now in every municipality in the country with an average of 1,000 people employed in every municipality for 2 days a week. And in theory, at least, communities are meant to decide on the work undertaken. And when that works, amazing innovation has happened. So this is Football for Youth. And the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation has done a range of pieces of research on the role CWP has played in violence prevention in a number of communities, leading them in fact to conclude that CWP provides a new peace architecture in the making, able to respond to concerns of violence in a way that addresses both the immediate and the underlying causes. So how can we use this instrument more effectively in relation to that? Here's a different example. It's through EPWP in Cape Town, and it's providing work for homeless people in partnership with an NGO called Streetscapes, and also in partnership with the Cape Town Improvement District, i.e. the private sector. And it's an urban agriculture initiative with really fabulous outcomes. There's also real scope for innovation in new forms of public value, particularly using digital technologies. So here's an example of Bulungula in the Wild Coast using community radio with youth engaged in interviewing local people, collecting social histories, providing information. They sent a delegation to the National Arts Festival the last time it was not virtual, created a whole lot of local content and transmit to over 100 villages. There have been initiatives to look at addressing the backlog of title deeds, and this could easily be converted into a public employment model to address this, and in the process, unlock assets and create township housing markets. In Gauteng, the township economy surveys undertaken by the province used a form of public employment model to train and employ 750 youth to undertake surveys of 9 townships. Township economies on tablets, creating huge public value in the process. So these are just appeals to think in different ways about how we unlock the social value of labor, creating public value, and in the process, creating inclusion, agency, structure, networks, and purpose for many people currently excluded. Part of what we need to address in different ways is the potential interface with market development and enterprise support strategies. This is just one example. Trees for Townships, greening of urban spaces. It's social employment. It's a form of public employment that can be done in many different ways, either directly by the public sector or through partnerships with the non-state sector. But it can also, done at scale, create a market for tree saplings supplied by local nurseries, in turn supporting the volumes required to support urban agriculture. Linked to a campaign, One Household, One Tree, making this a civic duty. We can do these things. We can invest in ways that transform the spaces and make them into more conducive for all. We can also use public employment to support social franchise models, and this is happening. It has been used, again, in the context of CWP, where a public employment wage is used to augment the fees that are paid by parents to enable the rollout of early childhood development. How else might we look at an interface between public employment models and social franchise models? And then there's the Youth Solving Youth Issues program, piloted by Harambee with a proof of concept in which they used a 2-day-a-week public employment model, and then in the balance of the week had a sales challenge with young people that was focused on learning to earn. And the results of this surprised me, I must admit, because I would not have assumed that the outcomes would be so strong. So if we look at week 1 and the net income earned from the sales challenge by participants, and then we look at week 8, you see that the majority of people by week 8 are actually earning over 800 a week from the sales challenge, from really a very low base. And that in the course of a 3-month program, the change in their main source of income from family and friends shifts to the main source of income being my business. Now, the point here is not to imagine that this is a silver bullet that can solve all the problems of poverty and unemployment through getting everybody involved in sales challenges. But what it does illustrate is that there's a lot of scope to support marginalized youth and others in townships to do better than they are currently able to do. And that the interface between a public employment model and enterprise activity can actually support such engagement. In fact, what we've seen is that the 2 days a week of public employment provides structure, income, and security, and actually provides a platform from which it is often easier for people to engage in income-generating activity. So, you know, the vision is, I think, clear that there's huge opportunity to think in new ways about public employment as an instrument that is done in more bottom-up ways through partnerships with non-state actors, not always in, in ways that are purely public sector driven. And the critical question is through what instruments? What do we need to change to unlock this, to make it more possible to happen? We do have the community work program, as I've said. On paper, at least, communities are meant to define the work that is undertaken. Each site is meant to have a reference group made up of representatives from local community stakeholders. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But interestingly, more recently, my understanding is that in some areas, in Cape Town in particular, local organizations have been asserting this function more assertively. And in the process, being able to utilize the labor of the 1,000 people employed through the program in ways that more directly interface with community concerns. Metros and provinces get an incentive grant every year. They have quite a lot of latitude as to how they use that EPWP incentive grant for public employment. They're able to define projects, and with appropriate partnerships, there is little reason why those incentive grants cannot be used to support bottom-up approaches and partnerships with non-state actors. But I think we need a more comprehensive approach to really unlock the potential of this. And hopefully that is a discussion we can keep having. But we need a more comprehensive approach to this. We invest hugely in public employment already. We've seen the potential, we can see the opportunities. It's a question of how we reimagine this instrument to really deliver stronger local outcomes. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kate, for a very inspiring input there. Really good to hear that. The flexibility in the CWP to enable the creativity, to enable it to connect to other kinds of activities rather than a sort of self-contained program. What Kate has presented is something that's much more flexible, much more adaptable to different situations, and to really bolster other kinds of actions to make something quite a powerful intervention. The question in my mind is whether, as well as the instruments we require, whether we also need a mind shift change to enable this kind of flexibility, rather than government in control, government working with other partners. But that's just for, I hope will stimulate some conversation. Please do put your questions and comments in the chat so that Kate can respond to them. Let's move straight over to Rob now. Rob, please share your screen with us.
Hang on. Sorry, just hang on, folks. I'll be with you now. Sorry, I'm having a problem here. Just bear with me for a second.
Take your time, Rob. No panic.
Wait, where was I? There we go. I had it all lined up and then something came on here. Hang on, where are we? Okay, and then.
We've got
Great.
it.
Can everybody see the screen?
Yes.
Let me just do that. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you once again for the invitation to participate in this. I think Kate has touched on some really interesting suggestions, etc., because she points to some of the structural challenges of trying to get more economic activity happening in the areas that Ivan was speaking about earlier. Another one that I think has got a lot of potential is looking at what we look at as what we call micro developments particularly small-scale landlords providing affordable, basically rental accommodation. And really the question is as if what role, if I can just see if I can change that, what role these type of developments can play in overcoming a number of problems. And I think there's both a housing problem and an economic problem that they can play a role in addressing. From a housing point of view, I think we know we have a major affordability problem, and that the vast majority of households in our cities basically earn less than 20,000 Rand a month, which is broadly speaking what is required to purchase an open market house that is being provided by the market. And clearly, therefore, there is not going to be enough buying power to buy that particular product. The other problem that we're facing as well is that the ability to address this housing shortage through national grants is increasingly coming under strain as well due to the fiscal challenges that the country is facing. On the other side, we also have an economic problem in these areas in terms that there's obviously high levels of unemployment, again, as it was indicated on Ivan's graphs, and not just high levels of unemployment, but people having to travel long distances to get to work. Now, one of the potential solutions is a decentralization of economic activities into these township areas. And I know there's a whole lot of work that's been done or is being done with respect to that at the moment. My concern with a lot of these strategies is that, unfortunately, a lot of these areas were established for political reasons and often for the wrong reasons. And they don't have a strong economic logic underlying them in terms of their location. So they have huge location disadvantages, which precludes a lot of key sectors in the economy from actually locating there. In other words, for a lot of these sectors, it doesn't make sense to locate in some of these locations. However, what we do have is we have a huge housing backlog in these areas and a housing problem in these areas. And therefore, I think we need to start seeing housing as an economic solution and not always seeing it as a social problem. Although I understand that there are obviously a lot of social issues that need to be addressed, and I'm not dismissing the social aspect of housing, but I think we need to put a greater economic focus on housing. And one of the reasons why I'm saying that as well is that housing and construction is a big employer of semi-skilled and unskilled labor. And there are a few sectors in the country that actually are able to absorb this type of labor. And so it has a very important role to play, not only just in addressing housing, and providing economic activities closer to people, but is able to target specific groups of people with certain skills levels. The other problem that we have in those areas, is, and I think Ivan was speaking to it a little bit, with the degree to which there's a leakage of money out of these areas when investment takes place within them. The question we then have to ask ourselves is, can these micro development units or development play a role in this regard? And I believe they can. And here's just a few images of the redevelopment of some informal structures, etc., into more appropriate forms of accommodation, even if it is pretty basic and at the lower end. However, this is also happening higher up the value chain, if I can call it that, in terms of more formal structures, where a large number of subsidized houses, etc., are being redeveloped into micro rental units, especially across the cities that I've seen. Why do I think that these have such an important role to play, and they can play a massive role? Well, first of all, if you go back to the slides and you just look at what I was putting on the left there, which was, I said, the 25% return that one actually gets from doing these developments. And if you look at that, you realize that with that high level of return, these are viable economic projects. And if projects are viable, you have a much greater opportunity to take them to scale. The question you have to ask is why are they so viable compared to other projects? Well, the first is that you have much lower development costs. You don't have to go and find new land. You can often tap into existing infrastructure. You can use the existing substructures that are on the site in terms of the subsidized housing. And usually speaking, the vast majority of the development rights are already in place. And these developments are being built at much smaller sizes. So we're moving away from the 40 odd square meter sort of RDP house. And by building these units, by building much smaller units, you're able to increase the value per square meter, which enables you to overcome the cost of developing these units. The other thing where I think there's a big advantage with using these micro developments as a strategy is that you are building within the urban footprint. So we try to reduce that urban sprawl, which means that we bring people closer to existing work and other opportunities. We are increasing the densities, and I think this is the point that Ivan made as well, is that although there are large numbers of people living in these areas, they're often living in overcrowded type of accommodation. What we don't want to do is to reduce the densities too much, because you need to get that economic thresholds happening, but we need to accommodate people appropriately so that they are living in decent living conditions. By also being in the urban footprint, we tap into existing infrastructure, and the increased densities in these areas, or accommodation of densities in these areas, etc., can lead to better integration. The other thing where I think there's large opportunities for innovation, etc., is around the ability to retrofit buildings with green technology. Therefore, we reduce the operating costs, etc., and obviously we improve the environmental impact that development usually has. And the last two is there is basically very few subsidies involved in this process, so we don't put a strain on the national fiscus, probably most importantly as well, these units and these developments are able to deliver appropriate living accommodation at an affordable price to a vast number of people living in these areas. Just from an economics point of view, in terms of driving the economies in these areas, if you just see if one looks at these developers from these developments from different perspectives, you have a situation from the developers or the development perspective. Some of the research we've done that these small scale developments employ about 15 people per development. The vast majority of those people employed come from the local area, which means that you get a local circulation of income, in other words, income being spent in that particular area. And you also have a situation where the barriers to entry, the ability for small scale operators or contractors and landlords to enter into the market is possible. And as we've also heard many times before, that housing and property development and housing specifically has significant multipliers in terms of people buying materials, in terms of the upstream inputs, as well as the downstream inputs of people then having to kit out their houses with various things. You generate a whole local economy in that respect. From the landlord's point of view, what we're doing is we're actually creating enterprises. We're not just creating houses, and those enterprises can provide either primary income or they can supplement households' income. And then lastly, as I said in the previous slides as well, there's an economic advantage to the households themselves in the sense that they don't have to spend as much on accommodation to get decent living conditions. Just some of the things that I think we need to do, whilst I said
one minute, please, Rob, 1 minute.
Sure. This is the last slide. Whilst tapping into the existing infrastructure, in some places there is the need to augment that infrastructure. We need to ensure that it is easy for these small developers to build and to comply with the regulations. And we need to look at certain technologies in terms of building materials, green technology, etc. Innovations in the design of how one actually develops on often what are quite constrained sites. And lastly, an area that I think we need to do quite a lot of work is to develop more innovative small scale finance, small scale development finance, so that we can take these developments or these particular developments at scale. So really, that's just my input. And I just think what I do like about these micro developments is that this is not a theoretical exercise. There is a large number of these that are taking place across the country that are providing both affordable accommodation and stimulating economies in the local areas. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Rob. Another fascinating presentation. I mean, I think Rob has emphasized the scale of this. It is, in fact, on some evidence, the fastest growing form of housing in the country, right? So this conversion of shacks to backyarding is really important. Demand for rental accommodation is enormous in our cities. It meets that demand. It facilitates entrepreneurship, as you've shown, and encourages private investment into townships. So it's doing many of the things that need to be done, but it requires government to play this enabling role that Kate also emphasized, which is not particularly happening at the moment. So that's some scope for improvement. We're delighted that Jak has managed to join us now. Jak, without further ado, I've already introduced you, so please start sharing your screen.
Okay. Hold on. Thank you so much, Prof, and absolutely apologies for the delay. It's, as with all of us, many balls in the air at the moment. I'm going to take my allotted 10 minutes, and I think really I'm going to focus specifically on the work that we're doing under the Township Economic Development Policy and Township Economic Development Act, specifically, what is currently the bill that is out for consultation. So I think it's probably important to start with a problem statement that echoes very much what Prof and the team have kind of put on the table already, which is that unemployment happens in townships. It is a phenomenon that is more in-depth and more pernicious and certainly more wicked in townships. And the surrounding economy within affordable travel distance of township residents is certainly not hiring enough. It's an SMME economy that tends to be very focused on sole traders, business owners that use labor as and when they can. And if you look at, say, the 900,000 odd things pre-COVID that would call themselves SMMEs in Gauteng, about 500,000 of which are informal, they're not employers. They don't tend to actually create jobs above and beyond that of their owners, and sometimes partial work for people around them. And that creates a massive deficit in the potential of the sector to cut deeply into the unemployment problem. And I think part of the problem why it persists is because township firms and workers face huge barriers to entry. And it's got to do with the way townships are governed and regulated. It's got to do with the way that township enterprises are understood. And I think there's relevance in looking at the data. So this is probably one of the more comprehensive data pictures that was drawn in recent years, which is our mass scale township economic geography survey, which got to about 80,000 different firms in early 2017. We've done a subsequent wave since then, which is a bit smaller. It's about a third the size. But this was a gigantic audit done with about 800 young data auditors, which Kate loves because it was another example of public employment in action, but conversation for another time. But what it shows you is, number one, there's a huge diversity of activity in the townships, huge diversity of economic dynamism, but it's very limited. The majority of township-based firms turn over around 30,000 Rand a month. They don't employ anyone, and about 90% of them do not use a business bank account. That stat is very indicative because what it demonstrates is that 90% are not part of the formal network of finance, supply chains, procurement, all these other things that are meant to be the basis for creating township-based enterprises. So our theory of change in terms of driving township SME inclusion that we've been pushing for a while from the Premier's office in partnership with economic development and a variety of other players in GPG is what we call the 3 Ds. How do you enable discovery of township-based firms? for the purposes of either financing them, connecting with them, plugging them into supply chains, either going into the townships or out of them, clustering them where necessary? How do you de-risk that activity, and how do you enable delivery on their part? And there's a lot of discussion, and we can certainly cover this during Q&A, time allowing, that demonstrates that this is really the core of the problem. You've got to create the ability to actually make the formal able to encompass the township, as opposed to trying to force the township to embrace the formal on its terms. So what basically has come out as part of our township economic development policy, which is now also going into one form of consultation linked to the Act, which is one part of it. The mission statement of the policy is quite straightforward. It's a series of regulatory and policy interventions to change how commercial activity is governed and supported in township areas, with the explicit goal of expanding existing businesses, enabling the creation of new business activity, and driving mass-scale employment and self-employment in the deprived communities of the GCR. It's a neat mission statement, but it's actually very, very complex. And part of what we have to look at is what breaks down to regulatory interventions and what breaks down to policy interventions. Policy interventions means that the executive authority in GPG can proceed by its own lights. So you don't need legislative approval. And there we're looking at specialized forms of financing, where we use non-bank finance intermediaries and wholesale funding to connect with township firms in ways that banks cannot. Very interesting conversations with BASA about that, happy to enlighten. Then consolidated buying systems. This is where you take clusters of township-based firms, as we're doing in the Swanee Automotive Special Economic Zone at the moment, and basically put them through a system that allows them to be consolidated under a master contractor to supply smaller contracts, which allow them to grow step by step. We can get into that as we go as well. The taxi economy is a huge area of focus there, where you're looking at how taxi ranks can be financed to become micro CBDs, how automotive hubs using the taxi industry as their client can be financed, something we're doing with DBSA. And yeah, we are actually stepping up on the backyard real estate model. So we're doing it at precinct level, starting in Tembisa, which is the first area we're working with CSP, and time allowing, I can get into that. But where I want to focus, because I think it is an area that the others will not have as much exposure to, and I think it's probably one of the most important, is this idea of what we're trying to do with the Township Economic Development Act. And really, we are setting up from a regional economic government perspective, the principles that will allow townships to be governed in a more streamlined way, so that the nature of business that is done there is recognized, zoning, rules, all these different things are aligned under a simplified draft standard bylaw. And what we're really doing is we're pushing that draft standard bylaw, either you adopt that as a municipal government and then you're in compliance with the Act, or you've got to adjust your own bylaws to basically meet that standard. And we're drawing up, as part of the Act, a dedicated geospatially defined list of what constitutes a township for this treatment. So just to give you a sense of that, what's in it. So it's about greenlining townships as areas of commercial development. So in a rights-balanced way, how do you make sure that the entities that operate in a township have an easier access to business licensing, lower cost access to business licensing. And basically, for example, one of the provisions in the Act is if you don't hear from a licensing authority within a given time frame, it's assumed to be valid. Zoning and all the rest of those things within certain parameters are assumed to be valid. These are the kind of standardized things that come through. Enabling access to markets and funding, that's really about the government policy piece, and setting aside the 30%, notorious 30%, which is often captured and waived by gatekeepers and other obnoxious actors at the local level, doing 30% for real and of contracting and focusing it on townships, enabling access to infrastructure for township enterprises, de-risking them for funding, systematically accelerating the commercial rapid land release, that's releasing government-owned land for commercial development in townships, and what I just mentioned, the micro CBDs, the backyard real estate. I think the core of that, just to cycle back to this for a second, and then I'll hand back the balance of my time. The real focus with the Act is on getting the regulations streamlined and the regulations right, getting a rights balancing aspect to it. There is a politically charged piece, which is how the Act also proposes the affirming of South African businesses for purposes of receiving benefits and support under the Act. and reserves those benefits and support for South Africans, and as opposed to for foreign nationals, which is a huge area of dispute and controversy that we can get into time allowing. But the core of the Act is really about regulatory streamlining, and that regulatory streamlining directly supports the kind of policy pieces that come in. So, for example, to do the backyard shack developments, you need a standardized zoning regime that says township-based high streets are zoned for commercial purposes. Because to get that right, you've got to put commercial at ground level and residential at height, accessibility for disabilities, etc., allowing. And this, creating township high streets in the process. You can't crack this idea of financing the micro developments without the zoning, the ability to draw up precincts, the ability to really do bulk financing. And that bulk financing depends, by the way, on being able to recognize these entities as formally registered. Otherwise, they're not financeable. You're financing a highly informalized sector, even through intermediaries that are able to carry some of the trouble. So from that point of view, I think I'll stop there, Prof. There's a lot that's in here. I'd rather respond or leave time to respond to specific questions and issues just once we've highlighted the intention. But hopefully that gives an idea of how we are trying to turn townships into commercial free fire zones. And I will stop there and allow the conversation to take its course. Thanks a lot.
That's wonderful. Thanks very much, Jak. So very encouraging here, an effort by a sphere of government, a particular entity, to take this idea of an enabling state much more seriously, to take on these very tricky regulatory issues, to try to streamline, simplify, or in the jargon, greenline is this new term, to enable activity to happen more quickly and to happen at all. I just had a question, since we've got a bit of time, directly to you, Jak, around, I mean, these regulations all have a history, right? They come about for good reasons, 99% of the time. The regulations are designed, so two particular examples would be to protect neighbors, right, from somebody building an inappropriate structure on the border of your property. The second would be health and safety. So building regulations are designed, to ensure that the structure doesn't fall down, that it retains its value for some time. That if there's no regulation, the thing, there's no guarantee, there's no reliability there. So the devil is in the detail of regulation, isn't it? Is it possible? I mean, we can't go into the detail now, but have you been engaging sort of systematically with the rationale for each of these regulations, and therefore looking at ways in which it really makes sense to simplify and streamline? Does that make sense?
It's a critical question. So what we're asking the public for is, because we have a sense, we've got some idea from historical studies of various kinds, which of the regulations are the most problematic. However, we don't want to just base that on our historic engagements and historic consultations. We're actually asking people to put forward their ideas and their concepts around where they think regulations should be changed. And we'll reconcile that obviously with the research that we've done. One thing I must say, at a principle level, we can't eliminate or undermine regulatory regimes that are imposed at a national level. However, a lot of these regulations, if you engage with township-based enterprises, are not applied logically, and in many cases aren't actually applied at all, because it's regulation that's designed for more established residential areas, suburbs, industrial estates, et cetera, et cetera. So the rights balancing piece has to be there. But you can very rapidly, if you think about it on a continuum, move from a situation like now where you may only operate a business if you have the following 15 things ready, to you can operate a business unless the following things apply. And that you've got to shift it closer to that continuum. So let's give you a couple of very practical examples. Creches. Right now, the estimated, and Kate knows this one, we've been on this for a while, back to my days in COJ, social development. The average township creche is not registered. 90% of them don't actually fall under the formal regulatory regime that is imposed by the various laws. Why? They're not zoned correctly. So you have a situation where in order for you as a fairly hand-to-mouth local business that is employing people, that's supplying a service and is even supplying a service at a standard that could meet most of the criteria, can't, because you don't have 70,000 Rand to hand to apply to rezone your property as commercial in order for it to be recognized as operating in the reality that it is actually operating in. So there's things like that that are crazy. The other pieces that are crazy relate a lot to the aspirations and the rules around, for example, the way we allow entrances and exits in roads. If you look at one of the most famous township enterprises in Gauteng, Busy Corner, for many, 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 many years, it could not get an operating license despite being as formal in every other respect as possible, because there was a road rule that says you're not allowed an exit on what is considered a main road. Freedom Avenue in Ivory Park, where Busy Corner resides, is a main road, but it's not a main road in the sense that something like William Nicol or hopefully soon Winnie Mandela is, where you've got all kinds of controlled traffic. All that it means is that the business was forced to have an entrance round the back, which was actually more dangerous and less logical. So the problem is when we engage with people from the municipality, so SACN are very aware of this because they were our partner in some of the initial consultations about a year ago, looking at how this could be shifted. And one of them was definitely looking at, there was definitely a sense that the enforcement officials that are involved in the municipal enforcement of bylaws themselves admit they don't make sense. But there is no regime that allows the bylaws to be properly streamlined. And admittedly, of course, things like liquor outlets near schools are not kind of things you're going to allow willy-nilly. Things like, that all of those kinds of things can still be in place, but you have a hell of a long way to go before you get to those niceties from where you are now, where there are a whole lot of overlapping regimes that really mean that a whole lot of things happen, but 90% of it is just simply not recognized or not registered. So we have created an artificial informality, an artificial slum dynamic around businesses that could be otherwise. And I think that's a big part of what we're correcting. Sorry, Prof, I know it's a very broad brush answer.
That's great. And in fact, there was a comment. You've answered one of the questions in the chat, which was about liquor outlets. I don't know whether you want to say anything very briefly, any more about that, or you've said it's not just a license for any liquor outlets.
No. And it can't be. And I think it's dangerous to do that because that fundamentally condescends towards and undermines the rights of township residents. They are citizens who have the same rights to dignity as a number of other people. Right. But I think we've got to, as anyone else under the Constitution. So things like noise pollution, etc., are going to be rights balancing activities, as they are in the suburbs, as they are in industrial zones, as they are in commercial zones. And I think that's why we are treating this as a wide-ranging consultation exercise to understand what actually needs to be changed to unlock properly. So for example, anyone who's dealt with the grocery and the service economy in townships, that diversity of data that I showed you, will be aware that the vast majority, in fact, I can tell you from the data, over 90% of those firms we found operate under conditions that are technically illegal because they're operating from a home-based business and they're not a registered business in any way. So the idea of a grocer, whatever kind of service is being provided, a welder, a micro manufacturer, where those things can operate and where they can't is a very open issue. Those of you that have a big wide global understanding of some of the issues with zoning will know that there are cities that don't apply zoning at all. The most notorious examples are in Texas, where you can literally have like a automotive repair shop running all hours and right next to a kind of creche where kids are sleeping all day. And the rights balancing is kind of case by case. I don't think we're going all the way in that direction. But I think we're getting consistent reaffirmation from the consulting groups that we're dealing with, from the township groups that we're dealing with, that neither the financial sector nor government is able to recognize and deal with them as formal entities because of some of these laws. Yeah, and that blocks them off from expansion.
Great, okay. So I hope people will respond to this opportunity to consult and will feed back to Jack and his colleagues on the Township Act. What I want to do is I want to ask Kate and Rob now, if you can, if this issue of regulation is the big constraint or one of the major constraints as far as you are both concerned, and whether you think that the Township Economic Act, the draft that's been presented, whether you think this is an important contribution to enabling the kinds of enterprise that you were talking about. Kate, could we start with you, please?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very groundbreaking, and it's obviously difficult. So, you know, the issue of rights balancing is at the heart of it. You don't just want a situation where enterprise needs trump residents' needs. At the same time, as Jack exactly put it, a whole lot of enterprises that could flourish, grow, and create employment are prevented from doing so by things that are daft. You know, that nobody would necessarily try to defend particularly. So getting that right is a critical issue. I mean, I think for me, and I'm surprised Jack didn't mention it, you know, a fascinating example of innovation over the COVID period was the introduction of the Informal Traders app that Gauteng negotiated with metros, where metros agreed to devolve their functions upward to the province to allow for a provincial-wide app that created all kinds of new opportunities to see informal traders and for them to be recognized and for them to get you know, so access and permissions that allowed them to function. Now, I'm sure there have been all kinds of speed bumps in the road of rolling that out. Innovation seldom happens entirely smoothly. But I think the point is that what's happening is new kinds of thinking that use digital technologies also, that take advantage of, you know, geolocating informal traders and new mechanisms for adjudicating rights that bring people into the kind of ambit of inclusion. I do also think it's important to consider how we use language. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, if an informal trader is registered with the metro or, you know, whoever they need to be registered with, and has an entitlement through that to operate from a particular site, why do we call them informal? They are seen, they are visible, they are registered. You know, they are small, but they are a micro enterprise, but they're not informal. They're not trying to do anything illegal. They're not, and there may still be constraints for them to grow in terms of zoning issues and so on. But I do think that partly we box people into problems with the terminology that we use, and that's part of what I think this act is also trying to change. So I do think it's a particularly fascinating development. Thanks.
Excellent, thanks. Rob, over to you.
Thanks very much. Yeah, just apologies for the earlier technical problem. I'm using someone else's laptop. I think anything that does assist in ensuring that these different developments in these areas are regulatory compliant, and anything that sort of smooths that and removes this almost artificial illegality, I think is very important. I think it's very important, you know, specifically if I look at those micro developments in terms of accessing formal development finance. Because just to give you an idea, I mean, these, you know, a lot of these developments are being financed through a range of finance sources, ranging from credit cards to unsecured loans to all kinds of forms of finance, and you know, those come at an incredibly high cost. Where development finance, you know, and that could be 25 to 30% plus financing costs. If we could access formal development finance, we'd probably be looking at financing costs of somewhere around 14, 15%, you know, huge difference. So I think it does have a role to play. My only comment is that it's not always just what's in the regulations, it's how the regulations are administered. And using Cape Town as an example, for instance, we have different planning offices. There are 6 regional planning offices, and within the same regulatory environment, how those regulations are administered is completely different across the city. So in certain parts of the city, people are able to get compliance relatively easy, even under the existing regulatory framework. So I think it was somebody mentioned a mindset change earlier on. I think there's also a mindset change that has to accompany the regulatory.
Good. Okay, Rob, you've got bandwidth problems, I think. So I think we've got the point.
It happens
Yeah.
as well.
Is it Rob or me who's got the problem?
Thanks, Ivan.
Okay, thanks very much. So Kate, you mentioned the issue of technology as a great opportunity for innovation, for streamlining procedures, making it easier for enterprises and individuals to get approvals. Clearly, we have only just scratched the surface of what's possible here. Jak, this is a perfect opportunity for you to say a little bit more about what you've been doing in Gauteng. Could you tell us a bit, what the objective is and how far it's gone and what the problems are? So one of the issues that people raise is the data, the cost of data and the lack of Wi-Fi, et cetera, particularly in townships, of course. Are you doing anything specifically to overcome that, as well as just, as well as being creative about digital technology?
No, sure. I think we have to be honest. The work that was done on the informal traders Mobi permit app, well, it was designed to solve a very specific problem under lockdown, and it is an important adventure in institutional evolution. So what we wound up doing was creating a very, very, very light Mobi app. By very light, I mean it was ridiculously low levels, like it was down to single-digit kilobytes to use it. Ugliest Mobi app you'll ever see, but it was usable on anything that was manufactured in the last 10 years. And we proved it. We actually kind of like talked like informal traders on 300 Rand cell phones through using it. So it definitely did work. And it used geolocation as a way of verifying where an informal business was. And then the license would only work basically where the individual trader is and where, so you couldn't register anywhere. You had to be able to trade in a specific location. And actually, to some extent, it actually is important. I'm glad that Kate provoked this, because it demonstrated the kind of the bumpiness of regulatory regimes. So everyone was fine with us using it for level 4 and 5. To identify informal businesses that were not CIPC registered, but were classified essential, and therefore should have the right to trade under lockdown. And we took it all the way to NAT joints and then to Prof joints, and we presented to a range of government fora, and they were like, no, Gauteng, go for it, go ahead. And we got implicit approval from all the metros and et cetera to go. But then one of the metros, for example, turned around and said, no, we refuse going forward for you to undermine our legislative sovereignty in this area. So it's been tough to plug it back into the normal as a way of doing things. We've engaged a few times, but I think we've got to recognize that there is a gravity to these existing systems. I mean, I think one of the comments that's directed at all of us is saying, would you please stop kind of like patting each other on the back and admit where the challenges are. So this is one of the challenges. You get very, very entrenched mindsets in the bureaucracy that will cite decades of precedent in their favor. And realistically, getting past that isn't just a matter of leadership and intention and making bold statements. It's really, you've got to get under the hood of some of these activities. If you want to change the way informal traders are licensed, it's not as straightforward as simply saying there's a new regime in town. You actually need to shift both the culture of regulation as well as the regulations themselves. So we're under no illusions that this draft standard bylaw and its application is going to be several cycles before it's at maximum potential to multiply activity in the township economy. But right now, the reality is businesses that are in that 90% window of not having a business bank account, not being registered with anyone, which define the vast majority of 90% of your township-based enterprises, are simply not, they're armed with nothing. If they're not in the lucky whatever percentage that aren't the target of enforcement, or if someone tries to kind of like impose a bribe in order not to enforce something on them, they're stuck. They have no legal grounds. And I think we've left them in that situation. We've stranded them. So one of the questions on the chat is, why did it take this long? Straight up, because again and again, government has layered different regimes on top of each other. And I agree, it should have been done a long, long time ago. But the challenge for me is getting past the culture as well as past the rules. And you've got to kind of change both. I mean, Peter Drucker's famous line that I often use with respect to government is very apt. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. But you can't, bureaucracies are specific creatures. They're not like corporates where people respond to a specific set of financial incentives. Bureaucracies are designed to be brake pads, not accelerators. Their whole universe is around audit world. Audit world is about, and we reinforce this, by the way, the masses of all colors, creeds, and races that celebrate when AG, clean audit findings are there. And yes, that's the mark of excellence. Garbage. Yeah. AG is just one part of the equation. You can have a clean audit and have done nothing. So you can't, AG is important, but you can't deal with it alone. But the problem is there's a variety of people in the context of government that will say, as long as I get clean audits, I'm fine. And I don't have to do anything else. And if you can't change the rules, you cannot change those people. So in government, changing culture is about changing the rules. I hope that's not too.
No, that's helpful. That's helpful. Thanks, Jack. I mean, it strikes me what you're saying though is that this act is a start. You're trying to put the foot in the door. You try to open the door, and you want to, and it's going to be a process. I suppose the response, I'm not looking for you to answer this, is that maybe you should start in a modest way with the low-hanging fruit, right? Rather than take on all the thorny problems of regulation. I want to come back to Kate. This question of technology that you've raised, I think is really important. Pursue it a bit further. I was struck by many of your fantastic examples. Very few involve technology. Now, people say that I'm too old to remember, but young people, this is a major turn on for young people, technology, etc. I know from my daughters actually that, they can't separate them from their cell phones. But, what's the scope for young people to have more of these kinds of projects around using digital technology creatively? Because also the jobs, presumably, the opportunities for employment in due course would be quite good if you could reach, skills reach a certain level among young people. And of course, creating their own apps, creating their own, the opportunities are probably infinite if secret can be found to make progress here. Have you thought about this in Community Works program and other employment programs?
Yes, I mean, I had meant to flag the fact that actually there are huge opportunities to think differently about public value creation and to think in terms of digital opportunities and in that regard. So, that's why the Gauteng Township Economy surveys using an iPad, aggregating the data, that's an example of public employment, and people don't usually think of it that way. Similarly with community radio, that's not such a kind of technological breakthrough, but nevertheless, there's a tendency not to think of things like community radio as a part of public employment. The kind of approach to title deeds. Similarly, there are many opportunities. Content creation. One of the examples on that board of opportunities crowdsourced from communities was public interest app design. All kinds of content creation come to mind, all kinds of data aggregation methodologies and systems. I mean, I actually think that is one of the kind of cutting edges of innovation in this space, and not enough thought is going into new forms of public value creation that use digital skills. Because yes, that is exactly what excites youth. I mean, even just frankly, digitizing all kinds of public records is a huge public employment initiative that could skill up young people, create huge public value, kick the ball forward in terms of the ability to use public information and administrative data for all kinds of purposes. So absolutely, I mean, I think that is, we need much more thinking at that level and much less of the more traditional kind of thinking around what public works entails.
That's excellent. Thanks very much. Would anybody like to come in? I haven't seen any hands. I'm not sure I'll be able to see them, but I noticed that there's been some many interesting comments in the chat. Laureen, I wonder whether you'd like to come in on the alcohol licensing issue, for example. you've been working for many years in the Western Cape on trying to regulate liquor outlets more effectively. Would you like to come in on this issue? No response. She's probably left. Ashraf, what about Ashraf? You've been quite critical in the chat about the fact we're all supporting each other and it's too cozy. Would you like to come in and break the consensus?
Hi. Can I say something?
Yes, please go.
Your organizers kindly unmuted me. Thanks very much. And this is a completely fascinating topic, wide-ranging from that applies as much to our movie Hutchinson Shunted and the possibility of getting land, urban, allocated to the residents of a tiny Karoo Dorpy. Thanks, Kate, for that. As to the other issues that I'm somewhat involved in, the alcohol side. So we have a provincial act. Most provinces have provincial acts regulating alcohol, but one of the big challenges is the issue of zoning and licensing. And one of the recommendations in the Western Cape now is to separate the two. And I'm not entirely sure what the unintended consequences are going to be. So, for example, yes, it's awfully bureaucratic to get a license to trade in alcohol. But as our lockdown has shown us, there's a huge, huge problem in many areas with alcohol and, particularly binge drinking and particularly youth drinking and so on and so on. And in our experience, members of communities are very reluctant to object to licenses being issued or even to complain when they have been issued that there are problems in the area. So perhaps my question, Jack, is any looking at the sort of unintended consequences. Now, hindsight obviously is not what you're able to provide us with, but have you sort of, I don't know, modeled or looked at any of these very welcome ideas about lifting the regulations or the particularly the stupid regulations, but on things like how it would impact on people, and the industry will just move in big time and fuel the whole thing. So I am very, very interested to know if you've had discussions with your liquor board and so on.
Should I jump in there, Ivan?
Please, Jack, please, yeah.
So the alcohol regs are obviously one of the raw nerves. To be perfectly honest, I think we've got to de-emphasize alcohol as the most viable form of township business. I've seen way too many well-intentioned, for example, grocery market programs go the way of just franchising liquor licenses as a means of creating money, because to be perfectly honest, it's a cheap and easy way of making high margins without having to do a great deal of business development. You literally just have to make sure the trucks can get through. You don't even need necessarily fridges. You just need guys with cooler boxes and ice, and even that's optional in some cases. So I think there's been a tremendous amount of cynicism on the part of the sector for all the protesting that it does, that it is responsible for X many jobs, etc. It is, but at the same time, it's benefited significantly from a very lackadaisical version of regulation in townships. And I think, in particular, you get people, and even though it's more in his personal capacity, there's people that definitely have sympathy. People, like our MEC for Education, because he's so exposed to the dangers of alcohol addiction and its impact on family life and the school system, he would be in favor of extending the ban ad infinitum. But I think what the problem that tends to arise is that we've let liquor licenses become presumed to be the most viable thing that a township business can do. And I don't think it actually is. The truth is we probably, to be honest, and this is my personal view, I can't speak on behalf of provincial government because we haven't come to a comprehensive view on this yet. That's part of the consultation. My personal view is I don't think we're going to be shifting liquor licensing rules that dramatically. I think it's going to be, I think the real opportunity is elsewhere. Because in many regards, I think it's wrong to say that liquor penetration is a deficit in townships. Leisure industry penetration that works with more coherent liquor licensing is. So that's I mean, if you want a very interesting dimension, let's look at something like, if you looked at the lockdown levels and as different restrictions were removed, some very, very interesting things started happening. So for example, when we hit level, or between 4 and 3, well, actually more under 4, when there was a provision that township-based restaurants, well, all restaurants were allowed to trade via delivery, but were not allowed to trade via in-person service. The Premier made the very good point that you effectively locked the township-based sector completely out of the equation, because delivery isn't part of their capability. And it's got to do with space, it's got to do with the logistics being in place. There's a few guys that have tried it, but you do not have the scooter mafia that services the quick service restaurant outlets in the suburbs available in the townships, and certainly not for the much higher densities and scales of people that you have in township areas. So one of the things we've looked at there is to say, okay, part of the problem there is that you don't have sit-down space in those restaurants. So delivery is one of the ways they could scale, but then you've got to readdress the question at baseline. Why don't you have sit-down space? It's got to do with density, but it's also got to do with not formal, cost of build. So for example, if you could take your average township Shizonyama and triple its floor space, you could create a whole lot of leisure that isn't about selling alcohol alone. And you've obviously got to balance the same way you've got to do anywhere else, but high streets come with this. And I think, it's the analogy I'll use to kind of maybe structure it in people's minds effectively. There's an excellent book, and it's from a completely different context, but you'll understand where I'm going. There's an excellent book on the kind of real misogynistic culture in Silicon Valley called Brotopia. It's written by the Bloomberg West reporter based in San Francisco, Emily Chang. And she's got a very, very good analogy for the question of regulating online activity. And she says, think of the internet as a city. A city has places you wouldn't want kids to go, and it's got places that have to be family friendly. And no city in the world doesn't have that sliding scale. She said, so why do you want the internet to be any different? I would urge you to apply the same thing a step back to physical spaces such as townships. There's going to be a variety of uses. There's going to be places that are very designed for family life, and there's going to be places that are designed for leisure. And those leisure spaces are going to include behavior that a certain percentage of residents are not going to find wholesome, or are not going to find affirming of family life. That's the reality that we're facing. But I think the balancing act, as everyone is saying on the chat, is the proof is going to be in the execution. Can we allow a properly evolving methodology there? But the last thing I'll say there is, if you get the principles right, you've at least got a basis on which to start having the legal arguments. And then if it means that there's a set of principles that are structured and there's some things that are going to be worked out by the courts, that's also the way law works. That's why you've got statute as well as precedent. And I think that while we've got extensive law on when you can and when you can't operate a business of a certain kind at a certain time in a suburban, commercial, or residential area, we have nothing like that in the townships. It's been broad brush regulation for as long as anyone can remember. And we've left a hodgepodge of regulatory instruments where they are. So I think that's the part.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jack. That's very interesting. I want to invite Ashraf to come in here if he wants, because I think he's raising the thorny issue of basically you create you reinforce the divisions in society by creating a kind of inferior regulatory framework for the townships, right, compared with sort of world-class standards in the suburbs. Now, is that what you're getting at, Ashraf, that you're basically lowering standards and this is a recipe for entrenching division rather than for promoting development in the township?
Well, quite the contrary, quite the contrary. I mean, I think that firstly, they say we see the world not for what it is, but for who we are and what we are. And if I listen to can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
And if I listen to the conversations today, we were raising issues based on how we see the world rather than what it actually is. Because firstly, I have an issue with this thing of township economy because it further others society. Secondly, if you look at the kinds of discussions that have been raised here today, they actually say, let's go help solve these township issues, these poor darkies. I know I'm not accusing you of that, but that's the message that I get. Secondly, I work for a relatively competent public agency. And all these policies and the things that you say, we must change our minds, we must think differently, new normal, and all kinds of things that have been said here today. I don't think new normal was used, thankfully. We are trying to implement all those things on that really great slide. By the way, I made a screenshot of it that Kate showed. There's no shortage of work to be done for the common good. And I think that's a wonderful slide because that's the work we are trying to do. But it is with enormous challenges, it comes with enormous challenges, enormous difficulties, partly because a lot of what gets said in forums such as these are unimplementable because of resource issues, because of all kinds of issues. And linked to that is what somebody said about the AG. Now, I could disagree, but I would largely agree, because if we change the performance management of municipalities, of the public sector, we'd begin to approach the AG reports and AG accountability different as well. So my concern is that you've spoken a lot, repeated things that have been said over decades, and I've been involved in this industry now for over 30 years. And I've been hearing the same things, and I've been trying to implement them. We're successful in some instances, fail hopelessly in others, but yet you repeat the same things. I mean, I read your article this morning in the newspaper, Ivan. I saw Kate's thing today. I heard Jack's things, and it's just esoteric stuff, a lot of the stuff, particularly Jack's things, right? And so I'm really concerned on the value that you are bringing to people like ourselves.
So what do you think we should do differently, Ashraf? Where do you think the problem lies? I think you should. Very critical, but yes, I am very critical. Yeah. Where does the problem lie then?
The problem lies with the way in which you're framing the challenges, firstly, and secondly, contextualizing those challenges in the context of the real development challenges in the very areas that you want to bring about change. Because if you understand those areas a lot more, you'll know how those things can be applied or not be applied, and thereby assist people like ourselves who want to do these things. And that's my problem. I think you're not asking the right questions.
Can I make? I mean, I think
answer. Yes, thanks, Rob.
I think Ashraf. I think Ashraf makes a very important point, and I think it's probably unintentional, but something where we have some sort of broad statements about township economies or township policies, et cetera, we do run the risk of a kind of one size fits all, et cetera. And the dynamics in each of these places, whilst there are some common issues, I understand that. I mean, often just because for historical reasons of how they were created and why they were created, et cetera, there are some common aspects to them. But there's a huge amount of differentiation in these places as well, both in terms of how the local economies work, but also how they are governed and run. And I think Ashraf's point is important, if I'm understanding him correctly, that it's the sort of systematic administration within these areas, et cetera, which is almost as important as the particular policies or the contents of pieces of legislation, et cetera, as well. We've seen that in Cape Town under exactly the same regulatory regime. The outcomes are very different depending on where they've been implemented, even within just the metro of Cape Town. There's a huge difference. And that's often due to particular individuals who are innovative and empowered enough to make some decisions on the ground and who want to see things happen, as opposed to just administrating an area. So I think some of his points are valid too, that we mustn't do this broad brush type of analysis in these spaces.
Yeah. Okay.
I think I'm understanding him on that basis. Maybe wrong.
That was helpful, Rob. And if he's saying that, that's correct. You have to be careful about overgeneralizing you have to be, but we have an hour and a half. We have to also to be realistic, right? And, you know, I wasn't born in a township. I don't live in a township. So there are constraints, obvious constraints immediately from that situation. Either you do something within your limitations or you don't. And I think we need to encourage people to step out of the box, to step out of their comfort zones, and to embrace these serious challenges we face in society. We're running out of time. I was going to invite everybody to say a last word, but I think we haven't got time for that. I just want to say something to somebody in the chat who kept saying, why aren't we addressing the issue of foreign nationals? I think that will be addressed by Jak and his colleagues in several other events over the next few days, consultations on this. It's clearly a very thorny issue. I wasn't trying to suppress it. It's just that, you know, I think it would be a bit of a distraction from the core theme of today, which is really about innovation and change and trying to do things differently. So that, I think, colleagues, I think we've had a very interesting discussion, and I'm very grateful to the three speakers for really giving us some new ideas and for challenging some of the ways we do things, like our regulatory system, and being brave to take on these formidable challenges we face. And I think we do want to encourage people with an appetite to do things differently. I think that's been the spirit in which we've had this discussion, trying to think out of the box, trying to come up with new ideas. Some of them clearly will not work, but you know, we do need this mindset shift to try and be bolder and more creative in the way that we address these significant challenges we face as a society. So thanks everybody. There's quite a lot of stuff in the chat if you want to follow up that people have been posting. I find it hard to juggle these two things simultaneously, but I've done my best. So I hope it's been worthwhile, and I hope you've enjoyed it. Thanks very much to our three stimulating speakers. Goodbye.
Thank you very much. Bye.